This time we're going to have a go with the Fujifilm FinePix S4000. I have a trip into the city planned, and it's winter in the north of England, and I expect to be taking my photos in the late afternoon and early evening. It's going to be some street photography. This is a very cheap camera. You can pick one up second hand easily for anything between £20 and £60, and they're not hard to get hold of, but it's still a good camera, especially if you're a beginner. It was released by Fujifilm, I think, in around 2011, something like that, and at the time it was considered to have a middling spec and was regarded as a respectable bridge camera, and would have set you back around £300 brand new, and that's in 2011 money. Nowadays it's just a very basic digital camera. The sensor picks up 14 megapixels, which is pretty primitive by today's standards, but if you're artful you can still capture some decent shots with it. I'll be taking photos mainly of people, and this type of camera is ideal for that purpose because it has lots of basic functions and it's relatively small and compact, so it doesn't scare people. The camera is battery operated, and to fire it up you need a specific type of battery. It's a nickel metal hydride AA battery, and you need 4 of them. Wrong battery and it doesn't work, it won't even come on. I suggest using rechargeable batteries, and you can use a simple recharger like this one. Buy rechargeable batteries and use this. The negative end of the battery goes on the spring and the positive end goes on the flat contact, like so. You can put them all in and plug it in somewhere, and it takes about an hour or two to recharge these batteries using this. Once you've got the batteries charged, open the battery compartment underneath like this, and then slot the batteries in, which I'm going to just do now. Don't worry, because it actually tells you here which way around the batteries go. It's pretty easy. Now the batteries are in, there's an on-off slider just here on the grip, and you can tell it's on because the LCD display at the back will light up. The first thing to say about this camera is that it's what's called a mirrorless camera. The other type of camera, probably more what people have in mind, especially classically for a camera, is what's called a DSLR, or digital single lens reflex camera. The difference between the two, in very simple terms, is that a mirrorless camera like this one relies on image sensors to pick up what the LCD display and electronic viewfinder show, which means that what you see through the display and viewfinder are not strictly what the lens is seeing. Instead, the display and viewfinder are showing a digital construction of what the camera's sensors are interpreting. The sensor here is at the front. In addition to the lens itself, we have a sensor just here. DSLR, by contrast, has a reflexive mirror, which means that the viewfinder shows what the lens sees. The LCD display is quite large, as you can see on this camera, and is very useful, but I prefer to make use of the electronic viewfinder when I'm actually taking photos. To activate the viewfinder, you press this button, which switches off the display, and you then look through the viewfinder here. One benefit of the viewfinder is that it uses less battery than the LCD display. If you need to use the flash, you can just press this button at the top here and the flash unit pops up. If you want to focus in and out I do that by moving this lever just in front of the shutter button. You can see this is what's called a varifocal lens. It's not an interchangeable lens, however. You can't take it off. It is fixed to the camera, so that means the functionality is limited somewhat. To be fair, the zoom is impressive for such a small and basic camera. It has good telephoto potential. Just some of the general points before we get into settings. Underneath the camera body is a screw hole for your tripod. It's just here, I don't know if you can make that out. Here at the side of the camera body are the data points, including a slot for a memory card and a USB connection for a data transfer cable. The best place to start in using this camera is by twiddling this dial here at the top of the grip to select an exposure control mode, and I suppose we should start with automatic mode because that should be the easiest and most user friendly. The automatic mode is indicated by the red camera symbol and means that the camera decides everything for you: shutter speed, exposure and aperture. Simple enough really, just point, get it in focus with the zoom function if you need to, then shoot. To take a picture you press the shutter button just here, press it down. To play back a photo you've just taken or watch a slideshow of your photos, just press the playback button at the back just here. The next mode we'll look at is another automatic mode but with aperture priority, indicated by the letter A on the dial. In this mode you set the aperture and the camera takes care of the rest. Aperture is the hole in the lens, so in literal terms the word aperture in photography refers to the size of a lens, but usually what we really mean is adjustments to how much of the aperture will receive light, which is achieved mechanically by adjusting the diaphragm or whatever similar mechanism is on the lens. Each camera has a range of aperture settings for that purpose. Aperture is measured in f-stops. One thing to remember is that the higher the f-stop, the smaller the aperture, which means less light gets in, and the lower the f-stop, the larger the aperture, so more light gets in. To set aperture, press the set button just here, then use the up arrow to toggle between aperture settings. In fact, this camera has quite a narrow range unless you use the zoom function. There are two options, either 8 or 3.1 f-stops, which you select by pressing the up and down arrows. The general idea, I'm simplifying this, let me stress, is that you select the f-stop of 8, a small aperture, if you want to photograph something at a distance and need a large depth of field. The f-stop of 3.1, the narrower depth of field, will be more suitable for photographing stuff near to you while perhaps having the background out of focus. Given that I'm mainly going to be photographing people in the street who are relatively near, I'll probably need a large aperture, so I'll select 3.1. Bear in mind though that use of the zoom function to vary the lens will also vary the aperture. If we now switch to manual mode, indicated by the letter M on the dial there, this is my preferred mode for this camera because it gives you a lot of control and you can experiment. In manual mode we can set both aperture and shutter speed. It's pretty easy to do. Again, once you're in manual mode, just press the set button here. You'll then be given some options indicated by the arrows. You can scroll up and down to select shutter speed and left to right to select aperture, for which you have a choice of 3.6 or 9 in this mode. I'll stick with the I'll stick with a 3.6 for my aperture for the time being. Now, whereas aperture is the setting to determine how much light goes into the sensor, shutter speed decides how quickly the photo is taken. The two things influence each other. I've selected a large aperture and I know I'll be using the flash at points. I think my shutter speed needs to be fairly slow because I need to let in as much light as possible. The basic principle in street photography is that shutter speed has to be fast enough to freeze motion in people. During the day I'd typically try to have a shutter speed of 2/50th of a second or faster, but as it's going to be dark I'm going down to 125th of a second, and I may select fast if I need to photograph people who are walking or there's a lot of artificial light. Some people say that as a rule of thumb or as a benchmark you should use a shutter speed of 1 over twice the focal length of the lens, which here would give me a shutter speed of somewhere around 60th of a second. Or higher if I use the zoom function, but I don't generally follow that. I'll use 125th of a second today because it's going to be low light and then dark. I think any less than 125th would risk blurring. As you're going through changing the settings in manual mode, there is a plus-minus exposure indicator that tells you the amount the picture will be under or overexposed at current settings. And that's just on the display to the right there. Pictures taken with the indicator to the left of centre will be underexposed. Pictures taken with the indicator to the right of centre overexposed. You can use the exposure button here and the arrows to manually lighten or darken the exposure along the exposure indicator scale. There's also a histogram displayed that again gives an indication of exposure for a shot. If you press, also still in manual mode, if you press the main menu button, that will take you into a further camera settings. First there's ISO, which I'll address in a while. There's also image size, image quality, and you can select whether you want to shoot in colour or chrome or black and white. Chrome is a setting you find on old cameras like this one, and it just aids colour saturation. In other words, where you're capturing something that has vivid colours and you want to emphasise colour, so flowers and whatnot. You also have a white balance setting. The idea behind this is to help the camera sensor interpret something called colour temperature. It doesn't just determine how white looks, all the colours in the shot are determined by how you set your white balance. The white is just a convenient benchmark for it that the camera uses. So in this case we're going to be photographing in low light and in dark. So I want to try and brighten the picture, so I'll want to perhaps adjust the white balance so that the camera adjusts the photographs to brighten them and bring them up in colour temperature. That's certainly something to consider. The camera offers various preset white balances including auto, fine, shade, 3 grades of fluorescent, which is towards the upper part of the colour temperature chart, and incandescent, which is the highest colour temperature offered. I definitely won't be using shade today as it's going to be low light. I think I'll try to warm up the scenes as I say, so I may experiment a little with fluorescent to see if that helps emphasise the warmth of the artificial lighting available. I may also try incandescent to give any artificially lit areas a more neutral colour temperature, as well as possibly boosting the deep blue of the sky, but mainly I'll stick to auto mode. Sometimes a colour cast, which is a over concentration of colour in a photo, so too much yellow or too much of one colour, sometimes a colour cast of that kind adds atmosphere and helps to convey a certain mood in the photos, and I do sometimes deliberately use the wrong setting. In certain situations you may even want to deliberately use the wrong white balance setting to creatively enhance the colours or influence the mood of a photograph. So possibly I will try and experiment with shade, but overall I want the photos to be as light as possible in the main. The next mode we're going to move to on the dial is auto mode with shutter priority, which is S. Same as the last one, except Same as the last automatic one, except you're not manually setting the shutter speed. The other automatic mode is AE, or program mode, which is indicated by P on the dial. In this mode the camera sets exposure automatically. If desired, you can choose different combinations of shutter speed and aperture that will produce the same exposure. Let's look at some other camera modes. By the way, if you're ever stuck in a mode and you want to go back to the blank screen with just a camera view, just gently press the shutter button like that. Don't push it down as you'd then be taking a photo. Just press it gently and it will go back for you. There's also a back button just here that you can use to go back to the previous screen, a back display button, which is also handy. You've also got panorama mode on the camera here on the dial. No, not the BBC documentary programme. I mean when you're taking a series of photos one after the other to capture a full scene, and here you can do that. The next mode we're going to look at briefly is scene recognition mode, indicated by SR Auto on the dial. That's another point and shoot mode in which the camera automatically adjusts settings to suit the scene. It could be night, macro, portrait. There are various options for the camera. Then scene position mode, SP on the dial, which sorts all the settings for you, including aperture and shutter speed based on conditions you select. If it's night, let's say, you can select night in SP mode. Then you have custom mode, which is C on the dial, and that allows you to save your own shooting settings and just switch to that when you want to. Whichever exposure mode you're in, this button here is for setting the variables such as shutter speed and aperture. It's a button just above the arrows. You've also got a movie recording mode, which is this one, just the camera, movie camera symbol, and the movie recording mode includes sound. The microphone is just here at the front of the camera. To kick off a recording, you just press the shutter button. The zoom function also works during video recordings. I haven't made much use of movie mode, so can't say too much about it, but it's not bad for vlogging if you've got nothing else to use. The next thing I'm going to cover is the F function button, which is on the top of the camera grip, just here. When you're in manual mode and one or two other similar modes, this allows you to set ISO, or film speed as it's known. In digital photography, a higher ISO means the image is brighter and sharper when you're using digital cameras. Since we're going to be working in low light and even in the dark, and we're using a large aperture with close-up to medium distance photography of people who may be moving around, I'll select quite a high ISO of 1600. On top of the grip here are the also the face detection and burst buttons, just here behind the shutter button. Face detection, when you press it and then select it in the viewfinder, select it in the LCD display, helps to get faces automatically in focus, so it's very useful. I don't use it really, but it is nevertheless useful for some people. Burst mode means the camera takes a number of multiple photos when the shutter button is pressed. Now that I've explained the exposure modes, I'll also cover the different shooting modes here on the back, which are indicated by the symbols beside the arrows. The up arrow is for zoom mode, which is for taking pictures within pictures. The down arrow is to select a timer. When you're in pretty much any exposure mode, just press the down arrow, then select the timer you want. It's either 2 seconds or 10 seconds. The left arrow is for macro mode, where you can photograph things really up close, and pressing the right arrow is another way of activating the flash. I hold the camera like this, with my left hand beneath the lens, and my right hand over the shutter. This helps me steady it. Personally, I prefer to put this camera in manual mode pretty much the whole time, unless I'm recording in movie mode. And as I say, I tend to use a small aperture of 3.1 or 3.9 and something like that, and benchmark the shutter speed at 250th, but today I will reduce the shutter speed to 125th. As mentioned before, I will give it a higher ISO of 1600. Just to add, it is possible to take the opposite approach in low light. I could instead narrow down the aperture and use that with a slow shutter speed and a low ISO, but I prefer the approach I've just outlined.
I ended up having a walk around Hull city centre as it turned dark, and I came away with 37 or so photos, and here they are. The first one is the Philip Larkin statue at Hull railway station. This dates back to 2010. The composition of my photo is poor. For some reason I didn't get the full statue in the shot, but the exposure is good, so I'm pleased with that. The next 3 photos are of ventilation ducts, again within the railway station. Again, I'm quite pleased with how these turned out, both technically and from a composition point of view, but I think they do look a bit dark. I could have made better use of colour balance. This one is a better view of the Philip Larkin statue, and I managed to capture a couple of commuters waiting in the shot. I quite like this one. This is a clock in the station. Again, the only issue I see with this is it's a bit dark. I think I could have introduced some brightening, either by changing the colour balance or upping the ISO. I also like this one. I just think I could have brightened it a bit, either with some colour or ISO, and I could have used some colour balance to bring out the blueness of the sky. The photo shows a Hull cenotaph in the background and the Boer War Memorial in the foreground, which is situated opposite the railway station. The Boer War statue is officially named the South African War Memorial, unveiled on the 5th of November 1904. The next few photos are closer shots of the cenotaph. The same comment applies to this one. It's okay, but it's a bit dark, but I do like these angled shots of the cenotaph. Here's a shop called Bronx in Hull. I like this photo, but again it's too dark. It needed to be brighter. I needed to compensate more for the conditions. I think this one of the men waiting around is my favourite of them all. I think I got it just about right and I like the shot. Here's a bunch of men posing for me. I do like this one. They were very friendly and noticed I was taking photos and asked if I would photograph them. Here's a good one of the phone box, but again the lesson learned is that it's a bit too dark. It needs colour or more ISO. Same for this one of the nail bar. It was getting really dark by this point, and here's the Wilberforce Monument. I decided to take a few shots of the statue in stark relief. I think it was fairly effective. I think maybe I could have done something with the sky, maybe brightened it a bit more with colour balance, but I still think these shots are okay, and I hope they're interesting. I also got some of the lights at a zebra crossing near the monument. I think these turned out how I wanted. I also like the phone box. I think that looks okay. These last few show the front of an art gallery, a cafe and a supermarket, respectively. They're too dark. I needed to make further adjustments to the camera, but I will have another go in the near future.